As you know, the Ethics Centre has been engaged by the Society to work with it to review and to renew the ethical framework that applies to the organisation as a whole and to its members. And it's doing so at a particularly interesting and I think challenging time. Everybody recognises that there's been a somewhat profound and precipitous decline in trust in institutions of all kinds across society. We've seen it in relation to well-established bodies in politics, in business, in religion, and of course in the professions themselves. And this is not only damaging to professional bodies and to society itself, but of course it takes a toll on the individual members of these organisations. And people ask, how has that been brought to this point? Is it because there are wicked individuals constantly undermining trust, or is there something else at work? In our view, there is something else. Typically when you talk to people about the choices they make, they will explain what they do, not by reference to any explicit framework of values and principles, but more often by saying, well, we do this because that's just the way things are done around here, or because everybody does it. And the effect of this is that often it's good people who do bad things that bring organisations into disrepute. And the reason they do that is that they've often lost sight of the fundamental grounds on which those institutions were originally established. They simply don't recall why people came together in the first place to create the institutions which have sustained them and others in their professions, for example, sometimes over many centuries. Now, I think that's what's been happening recently in many areas. And as a general proposition, I'd like to put to you that there's been a forgetting, a profound forgetting in some cases, of exactly what a profession is and how it's to be distinguished from other organs that exist within society, particularly in relation to the market. You see, there are two worlds that sit together, sometimes a little uncomfortably, from which each of us has to make a choice. One world, the world of the market, licenses the pursuit of self-interest through the satisfaction of the wants of others. It's actually originally conceived as quite a benign institution by the moral philosopher Adam Smith. It was intended as a tool not to enrich a few, but to increase the stock of common good for all. And the market was supposed to be a place in which people freely transacted. They were not to lie, they were not to cheat, they were not to use power oppressively. Each of those things a distortion of a free market. But nonetheless, it's true that Adam Smith said that it's not through benevolence that the brewer or the butcher or the baker make provision for our dinner. Rather, they do so on the basis of self-love or self-interest. And so since that time, an increasing number of people have embraced that idea, and it's become a dominant worldview as to how one ought to engage. Yet, alongside the market was an entirely different collection of people who never bought into, who never accepted the basic assumption on which the market is based, namely the primacy of self-interest moderated by the hand of the invisible hand. This group of people, the professions, made a formal commitment that they would subordinate self-interest, that instead of satisfying the wants of people, they would serve their interests, an entirely different thing. And we can see that simple distinction in the example of, say, one person who on a Monday morning walks into a corner store and asks to buy a block of dairy milk chocolate or something like that. The merchant only cares about one thing. Does that person have the tariff to pay the cost of the chocolate? If so, the transaction is done and the person leaves. If on that same day that same person later goes to their doctor and was to say, "Doctor, I really want dairy milk chocolate," if the doctor knew them to be a diabetic, they would say, "No, it is not my task to give you what you want. Rather, I need to serve your interests, and your interests will not be served by that provision. No matter what you offer to pay me, no matter how much you tell me you want it, it's not my task to do that, because I have a higher obligation to act in your interests, and in doing so to serve an even greater good, namely that of society." And it's that social good which is reflected in the social compact that society makes with the professions. Societies understand that if you're not going to pursue self-interest, if you're not merely going to satisfy wants, that this comes at a potential cost. And so what society has done is it said, this service is so valuable to us, what we will do is accord to you a number of special benefits. We'll accord you status. We will reserve certain types of work that only you may do within the professions. In doing that, we will ensure that you have not just a basic, but a reasonable and sometimes very good source of income. But all of that comes at the cost that those who voluntarily elect to be within the professions do so, understanding the primary obligations that they have. Well, of course, members of the society are members of a profession that emerged in around 1800, which is when the surgeons finally and formally separated from the old market guild of barber surgeons, where they made a promise to not pursue self-interest as they would in the market, but instead act in the spirit of public service, preferring the interests of others to their own, satisfying not their wants but serving their interests. All of those promises were made, and in return for that social compact, doctors and surgeons in particular were accorded a number of the privileges that I described by reference to that social compact. But what society gives, it can also take away. And what we've seen over time is that there's been a degradation, if you like, in the social compact, in which a number of people in the professions have begun to confuse in their own mind whether they are within that world, the world of the professions, or whether they are allowed in some senses to drift into an altogether different world, the world of the market. And so you'll see, for example, law firms that say that they are just a business in the law, or accounting firms that say, well, we just run a business in accounting, much like they might say, we just run a business in plumbing services or ship's chandlery or whatever else you might think. And I suppose there's a risk too for some surgeons that they may come to see that they're just running a business in surgery, in plastic surgery. But the more that's allowed to happen, the more the notion of interpersonal accountability that binds a profession together is allowed to degrade, then the greater the risk that members of the profession will begin to betray the promise that's implied in the social compact and then court the disregard and mistrust of the community. And these days, in a world of social media, in which the actions of one affect the actions of all through a kind of contagion that comes from the network effect in social media, that's damaging to all. Not only do the individuals within the profession who truly understand that commitment and commit themselves to act in that way, not only are they damaged, not only is the profession as a whole damaged, but society itself is ultimately damaged. Now, the antidote to this is to have a proper regard to ethics. Not as a system of compliance where it's just a whole series of rules which are codified, which are brought to bear upon otherwise autonomous individuals, but instead by having a clear understanding of a defining purpose, a set of core values and principles which guide the choices that members of the profession make within a set of relationships of interpersonal accountability. Not to hem people in to stop them doing bad things, but to allow good people to make proper choices based on reflection and therefore to try and build around them the conditions under which the community can continue to bestow its trust and regard. An outcome in which reflective practitioners not only serve their own enlightened self-interest, but do so in a way which ultimately privileges the interests of the community that they serve and the patients to whom they have a primary responsibility. What we're hoping to do in going back to the core, if you like, of ethics within the society is to rebuild, if you like, those ethical foundations, at least uncover them, look at them, inspect them, ensure that they're invested with new life for a contemporary period. And so it is that we're really delighted to be able to work with members of the society on this project, and I look forward in due course to seeing the outcomes not merely as a piece of interesting thinking and investigation, but a set of practical tools which can be made available to members of this profession.